Welcome. Tonight's story is one of the most disturbing and rarely spoken secrets buried in the history of 1847. Before we begin, tell me where you're watching from and make sure to subscribe, because uncovering the truth behind these forgotten events takes hours of deep research, record hunting, and verification. What you're about to hear isn't a myth. It's the unsettling tale of a widow who used her own 5 daughters to create a new bloodline. With the tallest enslaved man on her Georgia property, a plan that shocked even the neighboring plantations. The widow's obsession did not begin overnight. It grew slowly, like a quiet weed that spreads so gradually no one notices until the entire field is strangled. In 1847, after her husband's unexpected death, the plantation that once ran like a rigid machine fell into a strange silence. Fields that once echoed with the sharp whistles of overseers now carried only the soft rustle of unpicked crops. The widow, once known for her strict but predictable temper, transformed into something colder, a woman whose eyes no longer focused on the present, but somewhere far away, as if tracking an idea only she understood. Her husband had left behind debt, a declining estate, and a reputation she could not maintain alone. In the deep South, power was tied to lineage, strong sons, influential alliances, and bodies capable of labor. With no sons to inherit the land and 5 daughters seen by society as burdens rather than assets, the widow felt as though her world was collapsing piece by piece. The pressure of losing everything, land, status, survival, crushed her rational mind. She convinced herself that the only way forward was to rebuild from blood itself. People whispered that grief can twist a mind. In her case, grief sharpened it, hardened it, and reshaped it into something unrecognizable. She spent long nights walking through the empty halls with candles burning low, studying old journals her husband left behind, notes about breeding livestock, improving lines, selecting the strongest traits. Somewhere in her spiraling thoughts, the boundary between human and property blurred. Plantation society had already dehumanized enslaved people. Her desperation pushed this cruelty even further. In her broken logic, she began to believe she could engineer a new generation, one that would restore her estate's strength and preserve her place in society. Neighbors visiting casually would notice the strange shift in her behavior. She no longer spoke about mourning or rebuilding her husband's legacy. Instead, she muttered about improvement, continuation, and ensuring a future that no one could challenge. She studied her daughters with an unsettling intensity, evaluating them like pieces in a larger plan. She watched the enslaved laborers differently too, as if searching for a specific quality among them. Those who worked in the fields felt her stare long before they understood what it meant. One evening, she sat alone in her husband's study, staring at a portrait of him painted years earlier. His stern eyes seemed to judge her failure as no heir, no protection, no strong lineage to carry the family name. Something within her snapped. She stood up, locked the door, and whispered aloud that she would do what he failed to accomplish. She would create a line stronger, taller, and more fit than any neighboring family could challenge. She believed her daughters would not just continue the family name, they would redefine it. They would become the roots of an entirely new bloodline. Her fixation deepened when she noticed one enslaved man on the plantation, the tallest laborer, a young man with broad shoulders and quiet strength. He became central to her vision. In her mind, he represented physical perfection, The missing ingredient she believed would elevate her daughter's offspring above all others. Her obsession turned into a blueprint for control, secrecy, and manipulation. She began recording observations in a small leather notebook: heights, health, endurance, temperament. She tracked her daughter's ages, physical traits, and imagined combinations that might produce the ideal descendants. Her entries showed no empathy, no humanity, only cold calculations. The widow's world shrank into a single purpose, and everything else, including her daughter's feelings or the enslaved man's autonomy, disappeared under the weight of her obsession. Servants noticed her locking doors more often, whispering to herself, and watching people with an unsettling intensity. Her daughters sensed something too. Their mother's grief had twisted into something controlling, unpredictable, and terrifying. The widow began subjecting them to stricter routines, monitoring their movements, limiting their contact with others, as though preparing them for a future they had no idea was being planned. The enslaved workers felt the tension as well. Some spoke quietly in the quarters about the mistress's new behavior, the way she lingered near the fields, the way she inspected the workers, not with the typical gaze of ownership, but something calculating, almost predatory. They sensed danger long before the plan revealed itself. The widow believed she was acting out of necessity. In her mind, the plantation could not survive without a strong future generation. But beneath the surface, it was clear her obsession came from something deeper: fear, grief, a need for control, and a desperation to rewrite a destiny falling apart before her eyes. Her plan would change the lives of her daughters, the enslaved man she targeted, and the entire plantation forever. The moment she convinced herself that she had the right to reshape blood itself, the true destruction began. The widow's choice of the tallest enslaved man on the plantation was not a decision made in a moment of impulse, but a conclusion shaped by weeks of careful, unsettling observation. She had become consumed by the idea that strength alone could restore her family's status, and she convinced herself that height, endurance, and physical command would produce a new generation capable of outshining every neighboring lineage. Each morning, long before her daughters had awakened, she stood on the upper balcony overlooking the fields, silently watching the laborers begin their work. Her eyes always drifted back to one man, the one who towered above the others, whose back did not bend, even under the weight of the heaviest loads. He was known among the workers for his quiet nature, his ability to lift what others struggled with, and his endurance during long days under the harsh Georgia sun. To him, his height was nothing more than a feature he carried since childhood, but to the widow it became an obsession. She started watching him with an intensity that made even the overseers uneasy. She took note of how he walked, how he worked, how rarely he grew tired. She noticed he rarely got sick during the fevers that swept through the plantation each summer. These observations, which should have meant nothing more than a man doing his work well, became the foundations of a plan she believed could save her collapsing world. In her distorted logic, physical strength equated to legacy. Her late husband had always spoken with pride about breeding the strongest horses, the most resilient livestock. The widow, in her grief-stricken and increasingly unbalanced state, merged those teachings with the twisted social norms that already treated enslaved people as property. Her mind blurred the difference between livestock and human beings. convincing herself she was simply selecting the best stock for her daughter's future, a horrifying mindset that was disturbingly common in that era. She began arranging her days to intersect with his path. Sometimes she walked through the fields pretending to inspect crops, but her eyes were always on him. The workers could feel the tension, the way silence fell whenever she approached, the way overseers stood stiffly, unsure what to make of her presence. The tall enslaved man himself kept his eyes lowered, knowing any attention from the mistress usually meant trouble. But he could not escape her gaze. She watched him with a fixation that made the rest of the plantation uneasy. As days turned into weeks, she began questioning the overseers. But she did it carefully, as though gathering information without raising suspicion. She asked about his age, his health, how long he had worked there, and what tasks he excelled at. The overseers answered cautiously, unsure why she was suddenly interested in one worker more than the rest. Some assumed she was planning to sell him for a high price, given his strong build. Others thought she was preparing him for a leadership role among the workers. None of them imagined the dark, private plan growing in her mind. At night, she sat at her desk under the dim glow of a single candle, writing notes about him in her leather-bound journal. She described his height, his broad shoulders, his lack of illness, his ability to endure hard labor. She compared him to her late husband, convincing herself that this man possessed every trait her own family line lacked. She wrote that he was ideal, a word that reduced him to an object in her twisted pursuit of control. Her daughters, though unaware of the specifics, sensed something was shifting in the household. Their mother's eyes lingered on them longer, as though evaluating them the same way she evaluated the workers. They began noticing her whispering to herself, pacing halls at night, and locking doors without explanation. They felt trapped in a home where silence carried more threat than safety. Meanwhile, the enslaved workers whispered among themselves about the attention the tall man had attracted. Some feared the mistress planned to sell him away, a fate many dreaded more than punishment. Others feared something worse, though they couldn't yet name it. Even he sensed that something was building, a quiet storm forming above him, though he continued his work without complaint. Being noticed by a master or mistress was rarely a blessing. The widow's decision was made long before anyone realized what was happening. In her mind, she saw him not as a man with his own life, fears, or history, but as the pillar on which her new bloodline would stand. Her desperation pushed her to see him as the answer to every problem she faced: the financial pressure, the failing estate, the absence of a male heir, and the crushing fear of losing everything. And once she identified him as the key to her plan, she became determined to control not only his life, but the fate of her 5 daughters as well, believing that their future, and the future of her family, depended entirely on the body of a man who never asked to be part of her nightmare. Her 5 daughters had always lived under their mother's strict expectations, but after their father's death, the household rules hardened into something colder. The girls moved through the halls quietly, careful not to provoke their mother's unpredictable moods. At first, they believed she was simply grieving, but soon they sensed something else, something heavy and unsettling, simmering beneath her silence. They noticed the way she stared at them, not with affection or concern, but with calculation, as if she were assessing pieces of a puzzle only she understood. The daughters, ranging from late teens to their early 20s, were used to being treated as assets in social arrangements. But nothing had prepared them for the shift that crept into their mother's eyes. She started calling them individually into her study, speaking in vague, cryptic phrases about duty, future, and preserving the family line. She didn't explain her intentions fully, but her tone left no room for refusal. They knew better than to challenge her. She was a woman who never tolerated disobedience, and her grief had sharpened her temper into something that frightened even the servants. It began with simple commands. She restricted their interactions with outsiders, forbidding them from attending church gatherings or visiting neighbors. She ordered them to stay within certain parts of the house, insisting that important preparations were underway. The daughters whispered among themselves at night, trying to piece together what was happening, but none could understand why their mother seemed to be isolating them from friends, from neighbors, even from each other. The atmosphere in the house changed drastically. Conversations became hushed. Footsteps softened. No one wanted to draw attention. Their mother moved with an air of purpose, walking from room to room with papers clutched in her hands, calling servants at odd hours, making unusual requests that no one dared question. Even the overseers, men who usually swaggered with authority, seemed uneasy around her. It wasn't long before the daughters realized she had been observing them more closely than ever before. She examined their posture, their height, their health, sometimes asking intrusive questions under the guise of preparing them for responsibilities. She ordered them to eat certain foods, avoid others, and follow routines she claimed would strengthen the legacy they were born to uphold. The girls felt as though they were being prepared for something, but they didn't know what. The first clue came when they noticed the tall, enslaved man being moved closer to the main house, given tasks unexpectedly close to their quarters. He had rarely been assigned work near the family rooms before, yet suddenly he was everywhere, repairing steps, delivering wood, tending to the gardens beneath their windows. The daughters exchanged anxious glances, sensing their mother's uncomfortable interest in him. They didn't know the full extent of her plan, but they could feel the walls closing in. Gradually, the widow's intentions became clearer, not through her words, but through the situations she engineered. She began pairing moments where the daughters were alone in certain rooms with moments when the tall enslaved man was sent to that same area under some chore or fabricated task. The girls felt trapped by these orchestrated encounters. They sensed they were being pushed into a role they had never agreed to play. Fear crept into every corner of their lives. The eldest daughter, usually brave and outspoken, became unusually quiet, hoping compliance would protect the younger sisters. The younger girls cried in their rooms at night, unable to understand why their lives suddenly felt like a cage. They felt their mother's control tightening like a hand around their throats. The enslaved man sensed the danger too. His posture changed. He moved with caution, fully aware that anything involving the mistress and her daughters could lead to severe punishment, for him, for others. He avoided eye contact, kept distance whenever possible, but the widow's manipulations left him with no way to refuse assigned duties. He was forced into proximity he never wanted, under circumstances no one could openly question. The daughters eventually confronted their mother, desperate for clarity. But the widow dismissed their fears, framing her plan as their responsibility to the family. She spoke about duty, survival, legacy, the same warped ideas she had convinced herself were necessary. In her mind, their participation was not optional. She insisted they would thank her one day, a phrase that chilled them more than any punishment could. The girls realized then that escape was impossible. Their mother held all authority over them, over the enslaved people, over the house, over their futures. Their world shrank until only obedience remained. They had no one to turn to, no safe adult to trust. Plantation society offered daughters little power, and enslaved individuals even less. Everyone was trapped inside the widow's delusion, forced to play roles in a dangerous plan none of them wanted. The daughter's involvement was not a choice. It was a silent resignation born from fear, manipulation, and the certainty that resistance would tear the household apart even faster. Each of them felt the weight of the future pressing down, an unwanted fate designed by a mother whose grief had twisted into obsession. And beneath every forced step, every quiet nod, every trembling breath, one truth echoed through the halls of that house: nothing about this plan belonged to them. It belonged only to the widow. They were not participants, only prisoners of her ambition, her grief, and her determination to create a lineage that no one but her desired. The hidden room did not appear suddenly. It had existed long before the widow's plan, but it had never carried the weight it would soon bear. It was a narrow chamber tucked behind the old library, built generations earlier as a storage space for ledger books and seasonal linens. Most people on the plantation didn't even know it existed. The daughters had walked past its outer wall for years without suspecting a room lay behind it. But the widow knew. It had been shown to her when she first became mistress of the house, and she remembered it now with disturbing clarity, seeing in it the perfect place to maintain absolute control over her twisted ambitions. What made the room so dangerous was not its size or location, but its secrecy. To reach it, the widow used a panel disguised as part of the bookshelf, which swung inward only if pulled in a precise way. Inside was a narrow staircase leading down to the hidden space, lit by a single small window near the ceiling. Dust covered everything at first, the air thick, the floorboards creaking underfoot, but as her obsession grew, the widow began visiting it nightly, transforming it from forgotten storage into a chamber of control. She cleaned it herself at first, refusing help from servants who might question her interest in such a place. She wiped the shelves, swept the floor, moved in chairs, blankets, and record books. Her daughters, hearing her footsteps in the hallway long after midnight, wondered where she disappeared to, but none dared follow her. Their mother had become unpredictable, and curiosity had become dangerous. The transformation of the room reflected the transformation of her mind. Where it once held linens, it now held tools of surveillance, papers with notes, small locks, ropes for securing the heavy wooden door, and journals detailing the daughters' routines. She studied their movements meticulously, as if they were pieces in a strategy she needed to track. Every fear they expressed, every moment of hesitation, every tear she glimpsed became another entry in her growing collection of observations. The enslaved man was not spared from this scrutiny either. His work hours, his physical condition, even the times he paused to drink water, were logged in her ledger. She had become a watcher, a collector of human behavior, manipulating it with the same cold detachment her husband once used when tracking livestock. The hidden room became the nerve center of her plan, where she calculated, evaluated, and orchestrated the events unfolding above. Sometimes, late at night, she would sit there for hours, candle flickering, casting long shadows along the walls. She envisioned the future she was building, telling herself she was saving her family from ruin. In that cramped room, her voice echoed as she rehearsed conversations with her daughters, convincing herself that she was doing what any strong family leader would do. Her grief had curdled into something rigid and cruel, and the hidden room fed that transformation, giving her a private space where reality could be shaped however she wished. The daughters eventually became aware that their mother was using the room, though they didn't yet know how. They noticed keys on her belt that they hadn't seen before, noticed her locking certain doors at odd hours, noticed the unsettling quietness that fell over the house when she disappeared behind the bookshelf. Their anxiety grew as they realized their mother's control over them was becoming more elaborate. She was no longer just issuing commands. She was designing their lives from a place they could not reach. Whenever the tall enslaved man was called to the main house for tasks, the daughters felt an invisible hand directing those movements. Their mother was always watching, whether from a window, a hallway, or the concealed room where she tracked every detail. The overseers, too, began receiving instructions that made little sense, assigning certain chores at specific times, sending certain workers to particular areas. They did not understand the pattern, but they sensed something methodical about the changes. The enslaved workers felt it as well. They noticed the mistress's absence during moments when she would normally be present, and her sudden appearance at times when she was never expected. Rumors spread in the quarters about a secret place inside the house, a place from which she watched everyone. No one knew if it was true, but they could all feel her eyes, even when she wasn't physically there. The hidden room became a silent force pressing against the lives of everyone involved. It was where the widow solidified her roles as architect, observer, and orchestrator of a nightmare no one else consented to. It was where she convinced herself that control equaled salvation. And it was where she returned again and again to reassure herself that her daughters and the tall enslaved man were pieces moving exactly as she intended. The room's existence turned the house into something alive, something with a secret heartbeat pulsing behind the library walls. The daughters felt it, in the way their mother's footsteps echoed differently, as if she carried knowledge they didn't have. The enslaved man felt it in the shifts of his orders, subtle but precise. Everyone felt it, even if they never saw it. The hidden room was more than a place. It was the symbol of the widow's descent, the quiet command center of a plan built on control, desperation, and a belief that she could bend the future to her will if she watched closely enough. It was where everything began to fracture, where morals eroded, and where the fate of her daughters and the enslaved man sealed itself long before they understood what was happening to them. The daughters' fear grew with every passing day, a quiet terror that settled over them like a heavy fog. Their mother's obsession had transformed the household into a place of constant tension, where even small movements or whispered words carried consequences. They could feel the invisible lines drawn around their lives, boundaries that were not marked by walls or locks, but by their mother's unyielding control. Each morning brought new instructions, routines designed to monitor their every action, and rules that made them aware of every gesture, every glance, every sound they made. They began walking softly, speaking in hushed tones, always aware that a single misstep might bring punishment, or worse, further manipulation. The daughters sensed the presence of the tall, enslaved man more acutely than ever. He was no longer simply a laborer in the fields. He had become a symbol of the plan their mother was orchestrating, a living reminder of the power their mother wielded over them all. His movements were now carefully calculated. His tasks shifted to coincide with their own, placing him within reach of their mother's scrutiny and influence. The daughters quickly realized that their lives were intertwined with his in ways they could not control. Each encounter felt orchestrated, each moment laden with an unspoken tension that left them anxious and uncertain. As the days wore on, the daughters' emotional and psychological strain deepened. They began to withdraw from one another, each consumed by her own private fear and sense of helplessness. The eldest daughter, often seen as the most resilient, became quiet and hesitant, aware that any act of defiance could bring repercussions not just for herself, but for her sisters as well. The youngest, sensitive and timid, became withdrawn, spending hours in her room, trying to make sense of a world that no longer offered safety. Even the middle daughters, who had previously found comfort in shared confidences, grew isolated, each trapped in her own web of fear and confusion. The household itself seemed to reflect the daughters' growing unease. The walls of the house, once familiar and comforting, now felt like a cage. Every creak of the floorboards, every shadow cast by the flickering candlelight, heightened their sense of vulnerability. The hidden room, where their mother recorded observations and orchestrated events, became a constant, unspoken threat. They knew it existed, though they had never seen it, and the knowledge that they were being monitored so closely made every action feel public, every moment of privacy impossible. Even the servants, though loyal and often empathetic, were wary of intervening. They sensed the growing tension, understood the daughter's fear, but feared the widow's wrath themselves. The daughter's isolation was thus complete. They were confined not only by their mother's authority, but also by the silent complicity of those around them, leaving them alone with their growing dread and a sense of helplessness. The psychological impact of this constant control began to manifest in subtle ways. The daughters developed nervous habits, fidgeting, avoiding eye contact, speaking in muted tones, and an ever-present sense of dread that never fully lifted. Sleep became a fragile refuge, disrupted by dreams that mirrored the oppressive reality of the household. Even in the brief moments when they felt safe, a glance at their mother or a glimpse of the tall, enslaved man reminded them that the plan was always in motion, and their lives were no longer entirely their own. As weeks turned into months, the daughters internalized their fear, learning to navigate the household with precision to avoid triggering their mother's attention. They became adept at masking their emotions, smiling when necessary, obeying instructions with meticulous care, and pretending to accept the unnatural control imposed upon them. But inside, the sense of despair grew, a quiet rebellion against a fate they had not chosen, and a longing for freedom from the shadow their mother had cast over their lives. Through it all, They understood one truth clearly. Their mother's obsession was relentless, her determination absolute, and their role in her plan unavoidable. The daughter's fear, once a background whisper, became the defining feature of their days, shaping their every thought, movement, and decision. It was a fear that would leave a permanent mark on them, long after the walls of the house and the hidden room had been abandoned, and the events orchestrated by their mother had passed into history. Rumors spread quickly among the enslaved workers and the neighboring plantations, carried like whispers on the wind, growing more elaborate with each retelling. At first, they were quiet murmurs, barely audible in the dimly lit quarters, shared only between trusted friends or siblings. They spoke of the widow's obsession with her daughters, and the tall man she had singled out, of the strange routines she imposed upon her household, and of the hidden room where she observed everything with an intensity that frightened even the most hardened workers. These whispers traveled cautiously, for fear of reprisal was ever present, but the tension in the household was impossible to ignore. Workers began to notice subtle changes. The daughters were increasingly isolated, the tall man moved under her watchful eye more often, and the mistress herself seemed consumed by a private plan that none could comprehend. Every action of hers, every command, every sudden disappearance into the depths of the house became fodder for speculation. Soon, these quiet observations morphed into stories of something unnatural, something sinister, and even the neighboring plantations could not help but take note. Visitors reported an odd chill in the air when approaching the widow's property, a sense that something was being carefully concealed, and that the household itself had become a stage for events that defied normal explanation. As the whispers grew, they began to take on a life of their own. Each person who heard the rumors added their own interpretation, their own embellishments. Some claimed the daughters were being groomed for purposes beyond anyone's understanding. Others whispered that the tall man was being watched like livestock, his every action meticulously recorded. Fear and suspicion fed on one another, creating an atmosphere of dread that extended beyond the plantation walls. Even those who had never set foot on the estate began to talk in hushed tones about the widow and her family, wary of the power she seemed to wield and the strange influence she exerted over those within her household. The more the rumors spread, the more isolated the daughters became. Visitors who arrived with legitimate business were subtly redirected or delayed. The household seemed impermeable, a fortress where the widow's control was absolute. Enslaved workers who might have sought to speak openly about the oddities were silenced by the consequences of stepping out of line. Still, the stories persisted, circulating quietly through the surrounding community, passed along like fragments of a dark legend. Even children in neighboring homes felt the ripple of unease. They would peek from windows as the widow's carriage moved through the streets, whispering to each other about what they saw, the daughters walking silently behind her, the tall man always nearby, the strange behavior that no one could explain. Adults warned them not to talk too loudly, but the seed of curiosity and fear had already taken root. The rumor mill did more than just spread fear. It created a network of speculation that allowed the widow's influence to extend far beyond her immediate control. Other planters and families began to watch her property from a distance, trying to understand the strange patterns emerging. They questioned whether her actions were driven by grief, madness, or some deeper purpose. No one could penetrate the household, and yet everyone sensed that something was unfolding that none could predict. As the whispers grew louder, even the tall man began to notice the change. Eyes seemed to follow him more frequently, conversations hushed when he passed, and the children of neighboring households stared with wide eyes. He could feel the weight of the collective attention, not just from the widow, but from the entire surrounding community, drawn to the unfolding mystery in ways that were both tangible and oppressive. Ultimately, the rumors became inseparable from the reality within the household. The daughters lived under constant scrutiny, the tall man under silent surveillance, and the servants carried attention that seeped into every task. The community's fascination and fear amplified the widow's control, reinforcing her belief that her plan was not only necessary but inevitable. The whispers, growing from observation and speculation, became a mirror of the household itself, a web of tension, fear, and anticipation, where every action, every look, and every secret had consequences that extended far beyond the walls of the house. By the time the story of the widow, her daughters, and the tall man reached the ears of distant plantations, it had already acquired a mythical quality. It was no longer just a household story. It had become a cautionary tale, a legend whispered in the quarters and fields, a narrative of obsession, control, and the lengths one woman would go to in the pursuit of a bloodline. These rumors would endure long after the events themselves, shaping the perception of her household for generations to come. The widow's relentless pursuit of her plan sparked a quiet but growing backlash, one that began as subtle tension and slowly escalated into outright confrontation. Her neighbors, initially perplexed by the strange behavior of her household, began noticing changes that could not be ignored. Whispers of odd routines, of daughters being isolated, and of the tall man's unusual presence circulated beyond the estate. People speculated about what was happening behind the locked doors, and as speculation grew, so did unease. Planters who had once maintained polite relations started giving her a wider berth, exchanging concerned glances when the widow walked through town or conducted business. The fear and suspicion surrounding her household created an invisible boundary, one that reinforced the widow's isolation while simultaneously fueling the very rumors she had tried to control. Within the household, tension mounted in ways that were impossible to disguise. The daughters, already aware of the extent of their mother's manipulation, grew increasingly wary of every visitor and servant who entered the house. The enslaved man, once merely a laborer, now found himself at the center of speculation, his movements scrutinized both by the mistress and by those on the periphery who sensed the dangerous dynamics at play. Servants whispered quietly, attempting to share information or warn the daughters, but the ever-present fear of punishment kept most from acting openly. Each day, the atmosphere thickened, charged with unspoken threats and growing anxiety. The backlash became more pronounced as those outside the estate began to question the widow's morality. Rumors of her obsession reached the ears of neighboring families and even local authorities. Some feared her influence might corrupt or endanger her daughters, while others worried about the enslaved man and the ethical violations occurring within her household. There were whispers of intervention, though no one dared confront her directly. Plantation society at the time tolerated much cruelty, but the extremity of the widow's behavior unsettled even those accustomed to rigid hierarchies and harsh discipline. Tension reached a point where small confrontations began to occur. Servants hesitated to follow her instructions fully, leaving certain tasks incomplete in subtle forms of protest. The daughters, emboldened by shared whispers and quiet solidarity, began to resist in minor ways, lingering in areas they were forbidden, exchanging glances, or speaking with hushed defiance. Even the tall man, aware of the growing scrutiny from outsiders, adjusted his behavior to protect himself while subtly asserting his own autonomy when possible. Each act of resistance, however minor, rippled through the household, creating cracks in the widow's absolute control. The widow, sensing these fractures, grew more vigilant and increasingly harsh. She implemented stricter routines, increased surveillance, and intensified the secrecy of her hidden room. Her obsession with controlling the future only deepened as she noticed the signs of backlash. She became suspicious of everyone, her paranoia feeding the tension already present. The daughters learned quickly to navigate this heightened scrutiny, masking fear with compliance while internally harboring growing resentment and dread. Meanwhile, outside the estate, the rumors had begun to evolve into a form of collective caution. People traveling through the area warned others of the widow's household, describing it as a place where strange events occurred, where the boundaries of morality and control had been pushed too far. Travelers, laborers, and neighboring families shared fragmented stories, each retelling amplifying the sense of danger. Even without witnessing events firsthand, the stories carried an aura of inevitability, that the widow's plan would inevitably collide with forces beyond her control. As months passed, the backlash intensified, not through violent confrontation at first, but through growing isolation, scrutiny, and the tightening web of community observation. The widow found herself both feared and scrutinized, trapped in her own obsession, while the world around her began to sense the unnatural extremes to which she had pushed her household. The daughters, the tall man, and the servants existed in a space suspended between control and resistance, aware that each day brought new challenges and risks. By the time the wider plantation community fully recognized the scope of her actions, the household was already a pressure cooker of tension. The widow's plan, once meticulously calculated, began to encounter the unpredictable reactions of those around her. Fear, defiance, and suspicion converged in ways she had not anticipated, creating a backlash that would ultimately shape the outcome of her ambitions and leave a lasting mark on all those bound to her household. Every whisper, every hesitant act of resistance, every uneasy glance from outsiders chipped away at the facade of control she had worked so carefully to construct, proving that even the most calculated obsession could not exist entirely without consequence. The legacy left behind by the widow's actions was one that stretched far beyond her immediate household, casting a shadow over generations to come. The children born from her calculated plan carried with them the mark of her obsession, though they would never understand its origins. To the outside world, they appeared as ordinary members of the plantation or neighboring communities, but within the walls of the estate, whispers of their parentage and the circumstances of their birth circulated quietly, shaping the way they were perceived. Their very existence became intertwined with a story of manipulation, control, and the desperate attempt of a mother to assert dominance over fate itself. For the daughters, the consequences of their mother's plan were enduring and deeply personal. They grew up carrying the weight of participation, guilt, and the psychological imprint of being forced into a role they had never chosen. The lessons they learned in those years, the careful masking of fear, the navigation of surveillance, the quiet endurance of control, remained with them long into adulthood. Each one bore a complicated relationship with her own children, aware that the patterns set in motion by their mother could influence future generations. The trauma of obedience and coerced complicity shaped their identities, leaving them both wary and vigilant in a world that often demanded compliance without question. The tall man, whose life had been irrevocably altered, also left a legacy, though one less visible to the casual observer. He carried the knowledge of the household's inner workings, the understanding of the widow's obsessions, and the memory of the daughter's fear. His descendants, though unaware of the full story, inherited a lineage marked by resilience and survival under circumstances no one could control. Within the enslaved community, the tale of what occurred in that house became a cautionary story, shared quietly to reinforce the dangers of unchecked authority and the need for vigilance. Outside the estate, the story became part of local law. Neighbors recounted the widow's actions with a mixture of fear and fascination, passing down the tale of the daughters, the tall man, and the hidden room. Over time, the narrative grew in the telling, becoming a legend that shaped perceptions of the family for decades. Travelers, visitors, and workers alike carried fragments of the story to other plantations, embedding it within the broader consciousness of the region. The legacy was no longer confined to those who had lived through it. It became a cautionary symbol of obsession, control, and the destructive lengths to which one individual could go in pursuit of perceived necessity. Even decades later, the consequences of the widow's plan were visible in the patterns of family dynamics, property inheritance, and community reputation. The bloodline she attempted to control bore the subtle imprint of her influence, and historians or descendants piecing together records would encounter the traces of her actions in census data, land deeds, and personal journals. Each record hinted at the extraordinary events that had shaped the lives of those connected to her household, preserving a story of ambition and control that refused to fade quietly into history. The daughter's children, though distant from the original events, grew up in families that carried an inherited awareness of caution and resilience. They learned, often subconsciously, to navigate power carefully, to observe authority critically, and to protect themselves within rigid social hierarchies. The tall man's descendants carried similar lessons, adapting and surviving through knowledge passed down orally, in behaviors, and in subtle cultural memory. In this way, the widow's actions, though intended to control and manipulate, inadvertently fostered resilience and adaptability in those she sought to dominate. The physical legacy of the estate itself mirrored the human legacy. Walls, floors, and hidden rooms held stories that could never be entirely erased. Visitors or descendants exploring the property centuries later could feel the echoes of tension, surveillance, and the carefully orchestrated control that had once defined the household. Objects left behind, the journals, the locks, the panel doors, served as tangible reminders of a history steeped in obsession and manipulation. Ultimately, The widow's legacy was paradoxical. She sought to create control, order, and a bloodline to cement her family's prominence, but in doing so, she unleashed consequences that could not be entirely managed. Fear, psychological trauma, whispered rumors, and the stories carried by descendants all intertwined, ensuring that her actions would resonate far beyond her lifetime. What she intended as a methodical plan to secure the future instead became a cautionary tale of obsession, illustrating how a single person's drive to dominate can ripple across generations, leaving scars, stories, and lessons that endure long after the original events have passed from memory. The story of her legacy, therefore, was not just about survival or power. It was about the indelible mark of human ambition on those who live under it. It was a testament to the enduring consequences of control imposed without consent, and a reminder that the echoes of obsession can extend far beyond the walls where they first took hold, shaping lives in ways both visible and invisible for generations to come.